So welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch and was able to spend some time at the poster session. So just to introduce myself, I'm Kath Whitehouse and I'm a research scientist at the Australian Grains Gene Bank in Horsham in Victoria. So I'd first like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on both which I'm presenting from and from the lands which you are all viewing from. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of the conference sponsors and partners for their support in making this fantastic conference possible. So welcome everyone to the last theme of the conference, Seeds in Society and Culture. This theme is all about sharing stories and learning about historical and socio-cultural and legal practices of seed conservation and use. We have a great lineup of talks throughout this afternoon session, which will be split into two parts, including 3 keynote presentations, which we will kick off this session with. Each keynote will be followed by a Q&A session, and so any questions you may have, I encourage you to please write them in the chat function, and we will read them out afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first keynote, Dr. Terry Janke. Terry Janke is the owner and managing director of Terry Janke and Company, which is an award-winning legal and consulting firm founded in the year 2000. Terry and her team strive to empower Indigenous people to manage their culture and attain their business goals. The key to Indigenous self-determination is being able to control and manage your future. She is an international expert on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Her book, True Tracks, Working with Indigenous Knowledge and Culture, was published in July this year. The title of Terry's talk today is Sowing the Seeds of Change, Recognition of Indigenous Traditional Knowledge. So Terry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kath. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today. And I'm in Sydney, in Rosebery, in the sort of eastern suburbs on Bidjigal country. My own heritage, however, is much further north. I have Torres Strait heritage, Meriam heritage, and Wurruthi heritage as well. So I was born in Queensland, but now live in Bidjigal country, and I also work here. As was said, I have a law firm, Terry Janke and Company. We're quite a unique firm. We also do a lot of consulting work. There's a team of 16 of us now. We've been growing and doing a lot of work on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. But the traditional knowledge in the seed sector is also a growing space. My team here in the picture, just paying our respects there. And also I'd like to thank the council heads of the Australian Botanical Gardens for supporting my role here today as giving the keynote. Indigenous seeds, Indigenous plants are very important to Indigenous people, and the knowledge associated with them too is an integral part of their culture. Indigenous cultural and intellectual property is a term that is used to recognise Indigenous people's rights to their heritage. And that would include plants and also plant knowledge and everything associated with this. Indigenous people have lived in Australia for thousands of years, a long time, and they've adapted to many challenges, changes in climate, colonisation, all of that sort of thing has enabled them to have knowledge of how this continent deals with its natural resources, and therefore the use of traditional knowledge is seen as very important. And also the use of plants are also very much important to Indigenous people, but now more and more are sought after in industry. So Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights came out of some work done internationally in the 90s. It was used in Australia for the Our Culture, Our Future report, but it basically refers to Indigenous people's rights to their heritage. And looking at heritage and what is Indigenous cultural and intellectual property it's a much more holistic version of Western knowledge systems notions of what is, cultural property or what is intellectual property, and it's interconnected. So when I'm showing you here this map of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, it'll include things like arts and performing arts and literary works over at 11 o'clock, but it includes things that are written about Indigenous people. So in the plant context, it might be a lot of ethnobotanic accounts of Indigenous knowledge or databases. It includes traditional scientific and ecological knowledge, that's healing properties, medicinal properties of plants, cultural property, objects, artifacts. It includes immovable cultural property, such as land and sites. Indigenous ancestral remains is there, and languages. But they're all connected, and they come from country, so they're place-based. And there's also communally owned heritage. So there are generations that have contributed to this. So it's with plants, for example, many thousands of years of looking after plants. We have plants as they are today, but also knowledge associated with it has been a process of consistently nurturing that. And that's passed down through the generations, but there are also roles and responsibilities. And that might be in terms of kinship relationships to plants. And you may hear Indigenous people talk about plants being their totems, or their relationships with plants are much more at a spiritual level to look after it and pass on knowledge. There may be sacred or secret knowledge there that is only internally known to that group. It might be male or female knowledge, but those sort of customary law systems operate within Indigenous knowledge systems. And then there are also cultural connections, and these rights remain forever. And they're living cultures, despite the impact of colonization. There is much revitalisation of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous plant knowledge specifically has, in the last 10 years, been undergoing a lot of resurgence of Indigenous cultural practices. You can see that through the growing number of Indigenous people taking position in industries, but in my opinion, not nearly enough as there needs to be. But these are cultural rights as well. So as I was saying, these customary laws, these obligations belong within people. So they express it as a right, traditional knowledge rights. And just what sort of connections they have. I just did a quick list this morning, and, food, the nutritional value, you can see that now being sought after in the bush foods industry. Medicines and healing, and even well-being, with the sort of connections to plants and seeds that Indigenous people had. Shelter, as part of the identity, that kinship expression, connection to country, and caring for country is there. So Indigenous people being able to express those stewardship roles are reaffirming their attachment to country as a spiritual practice. And that can be very healing, and where it's severed, it is devastating for Indigenous people. There's also natural resource management. We have a thriving ranger sort of industry now, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rangers are working in the land and seas. And that's very good for species diversity, but also, managing invasive species, but also it is enabling Indigenous people to practice culture. And then economic opportunities are really arising here. We have Indigenous seed banks and Indigenous bush food collectors, suppliers, and also, restaurants and all of that occurring. So that is a big part of the value of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous connections to plants and seeds. But if I step you through what sort of rights Indigenous people need, and this is moving to be important in terms of how seed banks, seed collectors, the seed industry interacts with Indigenous people, to know what sort of rights might Indigenous people want to their knowledge, to their plants. And that is to own and control their Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, to benefit commercially, to be attributed, and to prevent the derogatory and offensive use. But it is also this right to say yes or no, the right of prior informed consent, and to have that connection remaining. And it's not recognised yet nearly enough as how Indigenous people want that right recognised under their customary laws. We see it expressed in an international document called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a 2007 international instrument which Australia agreed to in 2009. And it expresses Indigenous people worldwide, the connection that they want to their lands and everything on it. So Article 11 here is expressing a right to practice and revitalise cultural traditions. But the very important one that I always look at as an intellectual property lawyer is Article 31, which expresses Indigenous people's right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. So that, as you can see in the following text, does include fauna and flora, and seeds and medicines. And the last sentence there is an expression of how Indigenous people want that right in the same way as Western knowledge systems protect Western knowledge outcomes, and that's as intellectual property. Now, the declaration doesn't translate as law into Australia. It's sort of a low-level rung international law. So it is still very useful, though, to persuade policy. And I use it every day. Indigenous people also use it daily to navigate and assert their rights. Within the international space, though, there's work occurring in the World Intellectual Property Organisation, and that's an important forum. Australia is within that forum, a member of WIPO, because WIPO is harmonising all the IP laws throughout the world, like the Copyright Act, for example, comes to us in Australia by way of us being signatory to the Berne Convention. Well, since 2000, the World Intellectual Property Organisation has called together an intergovernmental committee, and they've been looking at dealing with traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression and genetic resources. And they have draft articles that they're working through to see how these types of rights can interface with intellectual property rights. But as yet, there is no signed off law or any signed off articles. They're in draft form, and we'll be watching and waiting to see what happens in that forum. But right now, the laws of intellectual property do apply to, holdings of traditional knowledge by Indigenous people and transactions. And I'm showing you here how it's sort of not one intellectual property laws, but many. And to get any rights, you have to meet the heads of those. And they are laws that come into Australian law, and they're products of the mind. They're Commonwealth laws. They really give economic rights to owners, and they have this limited in time protection, which after the end of, say, 20 years for regular patents, for example, it is publicly available knowledge, which is different from Indigenous knowledge, which remains with people. So, copyright is one area of law that is automatic and applies to knowledge. And for Indigenous people, Copyright Act has had a mixed sort of reception, because when people come into communities and write down knowledge, or they're collecting information about plants, the copyright owners will be the researchers. So the general laws there have been limited for Indigenous people to express it, although now we have a lot of Indigenous we have ethnobotanists like Jerry Turpin, and people write Aboriginal language centres writing up language and connections to plants. So we're seeing Indigenous people owning copyright, but you can see the limitation there in that it's only going to protect for 70 years after the death of the author, the person who writes the material form. But nevertheless, copyright is there as an IP law to interact with. I mean, plant breeders' rights too, which give rights to people who can illustrate that there is a new variety of a plant and it's distinct, uniform and stable. they can hold rights to sell and distribute the new plant variety, and there's protection there. It's a very commercial way of, distributing these plants and using your knowledge. And I would have to say that would be the least used IP law by Indigenous people, not really available to them to undertake that, possibly because of the scientific elements or the trialling that can be expensive, but not very well used. Patents law, protecting plant-based inventions there, is available, and standard patents are there to protect it. And you have to show inventive step and novelty. Often there'd been Indigenous people's knowledge patented by outsiders who had learnt about the knowledge, and now we're seeing more Indigenous people patent these rights. The example of the Kakadu plum, where that very highly nutritious plant from the north of Australia was attempted to be patented in Australia by Mary Kay, but it was very significant to northern Aboriginal communities who grew, collected by a wild harvest as part of their cultural activity, but also it was now they were developing their own supply networks. And then here we have Mary Kay applying for a patent, which didn't go through in Australia, although there are over 64 patents for Kakadu plum throughout the world, not all held by Mary Kay, obviously, but you can see here how a plant that is from Australia now being sought after internationally, and it's leading to patent rights, which then exclude Indigenous people's rights to operate in markets. But we have the development of Aboriginal people using the patent system, and I'm showing 3 examples here where 3 communities have filed patents with universities, as it turns out. So John Watson and the Jalmadanga community have a patent over the Mudgela tree, some active properties there, and University of South Australia is working with David Claudie and the Unsha plant, and then the Spinifex project there where Colin Saltmere and the Indajalanji and the Dadandi people are working on Spinifex there, and I'm going to talk about that one later. But I can see now Indigenous people are using patents, but they need to have access to the resources and the ability to do that. I wanted to flag trademarks as well, because trademarks are a way of branding and marketing, and often that's used in the sectors that promote bush foods products or seeds, and you file with IP Australia to get a registered trademark, and it has to be distinctive, which can often be a problem if you're describing it as in an Aboriginal language and it's the word of the plant. So for example, here I'm showing the Gumby Gumby plant, which was used by the Gungali people from Central America as a medicine for many years, and Aboriginal people like Lee Doherty here in the picture have been using it and selling it as medicines. But that was a subject of a registered patent, a patent about producing leaf oil extracts from the plant, registered in 2008. And then the owners of that patent were writing to other manufacturers and sellers of Gumby Gumby products and trying to stop them, and Lee was one of them. She was successfully able to argue that her use of the plant was not an infringement of the patent. But what was also interesting to note about here was that the company then tried to trademark Gumby Gumby, because that is about the branding. It gives it that extra protection, and trademarks last for as long as they're registered. But the story here is that through the examination process, the trademark office at IP Australia didn't allow the registration on for Gumby Gumby because it was descriptive of the plant, and other traders wanted to use it. You also have Aboriginal groups like the Bush Metagena product here being used and sold. It's a very good cream for dry skin. They have registered a trademark, Metagena here doesn't mean medicine. It's not bush medicine. Metagena is a different word in their language. But you can see here groups like the Bush Metagena women are using trademarks, developing processes about confidential information using non-disclosure agreements. They use protocols, and they're transacting through commercial agreements now. Trademarks become very important, I think, for protection of seeds and plants, interesting for Indigenous people because you can use them, they last as long as they're registered, and there's also the ability to get collective trademarks. And I'm just showing some examples here of like the notion of terra, or the tastes that are different coming from the land and the soil, which is used for grapes. That has often been held up as a way that Indigenous people could use GIs to protect their bush products. And as yet, we don't have that GI regime very strong in Australia. People are using certification marks. But I was very interested to look at the way in South America, the Potato Park have used collective trademarks to protect their biocultural heritage there and protecting species of potatoes from that region. Confidential information and trade secrets is very much used here. It's limited though, because it can only protect things that aren't already published, and a lot of Indigenous knowledge may already be captured by researchers who've come into communities and written it up. But nevertheless, it is an area that Indigenous people are looking to protect their collective knowledge. So moving from IP has limitations. I wanted to talk about the Convention on Biological Diversity because that is an international convention stronger than the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has articles that relate to the protection of Indigenous knowledge. And Article 8J there includes recognition of Indigenous people's right to respect, preserve and maintain their knowledge. And a decade later, further work was done to develop a Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, which looked further at how parties that want to use materials, genetic materials sourced from Indigenous communities or use of their knowledge would be shared. And the Nagoya Protocol is, I guess Australia has started, it's signed onto it, but the depth of its implementation is yet to unravel. They have, I picked up 4 acts, and the Commonwealth Act was the first to go in 1999, and that's the EPBC Act, which if Aboriginal land owners of lands that come under that Act, they have a right to enter into an access and benefit sharing agreement. Quite limited. I mean, I've got the Northern Territory one there as well, the ACT one, but I wanted to focus on the 2004 Queensland Act because it was recently amended last year. And I thought that this one was taking a further step to those sort of Nagoya obligations, I guess, in a more fuller way than Australia has done before. And the reforms introduce protections for the use of traditional knowledge. And so where it's obtained, people who are using it have the obligation to get the prior informed consent and enter into agreements with the knowledge holders. And within that regime that they've set up, they have developed a code of practice. And they've also included guidelines and a capacity strengthening tool. But you can see there in the list of the 6 requirements in the code that they're setting up the systems for how people who want to use plants or genetic resources from Aboriginal communities or work with Aboriginal people would have to look at things like identifying custodians, obtaining free prior informed consent, benefit sharing and mutually agreed terms. There's a section on public accessible traditional knowledge, stuff that's already out there, and claims of custodianship after biodiscovery has commenced, and also evidence of compliance with the code are all within that model that Queensland is now moving forward with. I think it's interesting to look at that now because the previous examples I showed you of the 3 patents that had been co-owned by Aboriginal peoples, they were all brought about by more voluntary, I guess, and ethical established arrangements through universities. And now that we're in Queensland where they have the law, it is now mandatory to do that. But I wanted to just have a look at an example of Colin Saltmere, who his group of people, the Dundjalungi, they're on the border of Queensland and Northern Territory out at Camberwell. The spinifex there is very strong and the nanofibers there are being used, the cellulose for, glues or adhesives, but, for building things. So you can see here that there was a research partnership that they entered into with the University of Queensland before the changes to the law. But nevertheless, I like to raise this example as a proactive way of how the Colin Saltmere and his people were able to enter into this agreement and negotiate benefits that were about bringing back cultural practice, training on country, empowering rangers, women's knowledge, but also, sustainable farming, but also entering into opportunities to share in economic development and ownership of patents if they arise. And they do have a patent to the isolated nanofiber, which is owned now by the University of Queensland and the Colin Saltmere's group. So in the group's agreement, they have the right to refuse commercialisation. And I mean, that was there. I mean, when I speak to Colin, he said discussions and negotiations with, research bodies that come in can be very complex. He mentioned, although this got across the line, it was a long process, but he was also involved in the development of the Code of Practice of the Queensland Biodiscovery Act. And I think that now the pathway is a lot clearer. So we're hoping that this will bring about more sort of fair and ethical collaborations where really in reality, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal groups have a lot to get to they don't have an equal bargaining power, and it can really affect their ability to have a fair returns from the sharing of their knowledge. So this is where I wanted to advocate also for protocols, and the code, I know it only applies to Queensland, but it really does also pick up on the need for following guidelines and codes. And I'm showing you here the True Tract's 10 principles that are in the book and that we use a lot for the work we do. And it's really just sort of, many of you would know these, and it's sort of a general understanding of how to interact with Indigenous people. But if you look at them all together and do a plan of when you're engaging with Indigenous people for projects, it can be really useful. So one is just respecting that Indigenous people do control the right to maintain and control and protect and develop their ICIP. Self-determination, being involved in decisions, having a consent and consultation process, looking at free, prior, informed consent. Principle 4 is interpretation and allowing Indigenous people to be involved in methodologies or interpretation of how their stories, their knowledge is represented. 4 is cultural integrity, maintaining the integrity of that knowledge and keeping it strong is a consideration. Secrecy and privacy, which I mentioned before, making sure that nothing that shouldn't be disclosed, anything confidential or sacred secret is not. 7, that attribution, attributing people as the source communities or the owners is a key principle. Benefit sharing, I think this is a real focus that could do with more work in Australia of how benefits flow back, both commercial and non-commercial. Then to think about maintaining Indigenous cultures. What happens when we archive or and then reuse knowledge or resources that were part of a project? And how do we stay connected with the next generations for consent, but also for them just to know what was collected and what is held about their communities? 10 is recognition and protection, and that is using IP laws like registering patents or using copyright notices or traditional custodians notices to protect these rights and recognise them. Contracts will also be a big part of this, and the work that we're doing at Terry Janke and Company is we, in the absence of a law for protection of ISIP, we are using intellectual property laws to the advantage of Indigenous interests. Contracts can displace that, and also protocols, using the True Tracks protocols. And, you know, if more and more people use these and take it up, I think there will be a lot of realisation of those ISIP rights. And so the principles become part of a process of how we engage. And when sharing knowledge with plants, you would see it's pretty small. I don't know if you can see this sort of flow map, but it's like thinking about the research project. What are the community needs to allow research? That's your free, prior, informed aspect. Then going on country, protocols around that. Do you need permits? What will be taken? Who will go with you? What can and you can't do on country? Back at the lab, material transfer agreements and protecting samples while they're in labs outside of country. And then how can the community benefit? Monetary benefits and non-monetary benefits are there. So we're looking for collaborative approaches and balances between the commercial and the cultural to also have that connection back to Indigenous people. So I also wanted to say that shout out to the Flora Bank guidelines, which was part of the Germ Bank release today. And I really like to see the development by Stephen Van Leeuwen, Alison Lullafitz and Damien Wrigley of this module of working with Indigenous Australians. And you can see there, I've listed some of the key objectives of those modules, which overlap with things I've mentioned already, like the free, prior, informed consent, the uptake of guidelines and acknowledgement of elders and material transfer agreements. And just to finish off on how the laws and may change in this area with IP Australia looking at whether or not a disclosure of source requirement is brought into patent is up for consideration in their Indigenous knowledge work plan. And that's it for me. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. And yes, I'll close off there. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for a very informative and insightful talk. I am a bit conscious of time. I can't see any questions coming in yet. I just have one for you. Why do you think we all struggle with respectfully engaging with Indigenous knowledge and culture? Is it because we're still quite far away in understanding its real value, although we wouldn't like to admit that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that's a very honest question to ask as well, given the history of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, the valuing of Indigenous knowledge systems, but also Indigenous people being connected to them. And I do think that could be one of the reasons. And it's also different knowledge systems. So you can see when I outlined the intellectual property laws, they're focused on a very different cultural knowledge practice. And that can be a problem, in fact, because it allows the taking of knowledge and without that connection. And we're only seeing now discussions coming into place in the last 15 years or so. But I do think it's also, it's a bit like Mabo and the Terra Nullius myth, whereas Indigenous knowledge was seen as being in the public domain, but now it is very much connected to Indigenous people and living practice. So changing the way that systems have dealt with public domain knowledge and looking at how it is really much part of an Indigenous knowledge system can be challenging. But I don't think that it's something people should be afraid of and not want to step up for, because I do think that now that you look at the Indigenous land estate, something like 57% of the Indigenous of the country is Indigenous land estate. So there are opportunities for groups to work together, and I do know Indigenous groups would like that opportunity so long as it's fair. In the post-native title world, prescribed body corporates, Indigenous people are looking for these opportunities, and so long as it's fair and we can get this equal bargaining sort of power and through laws or through practices, I think that there can be a lot of good collaborations.
Got time for one more from Alexandra. Can these principles be applied to Indigenous people's right to access publicly owned lands, to use cultural resources, especially where there are other environmental protection legislation that prevent the use of flora and fauna?
That's an interesting part. I'll be looking into that, whoever gave that question, but I think it could be a consideration. There have been, I think, limits in native title law. I think the movement is in the biodiscovery laws for rights, but also the movement is in with just that Article 31 with Indigenous people. I know it's an aspirational right, but more and more Indigenous people being aware of their knowledge and asserting their rights and wanting to have that respected in negotiations. But I do think that more and more you will see this occurring in Indigenous land use agreements, for example, could be one. But I can't comment on your other question, but it's a very about the interplay with other laws. But I think it's a good one to consider, where Indigenous people can have rights to their genetic resources, which enable them to practice culture, that caring for country, natural resource management, but also linking in to economic opportunities.
Thanks, Terry. That's all we've got time for, I think. There is another question. We're going to move that into the live Q&A. If you've got any other questions for Terry or for any of other upcoming speakers, you can continue to post them into the hub via the portal, and our speakers can respond to them offline. Thank you once again, Terry. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Kath, and thank you, everyone. All the best with the rest of the conference. Bye.
I'd now like to introduce you all to our next keynote speaker of the session, Professor Brad Sherman. Brad is a professor of law at the University of Queensland, and his previous academic positions include posts at Griffith University, the London School of Economics, and the University of Cambridge. His research expertise encompasses many aspects of intellectual property law, with a particular emphasis on its historical, doctrinal, and conceptual development. In 2015, Professor Sherman was awarded a highly prestigious Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship. His project, Harnessing Intellectual Property to Build Food Security, looks at the role of intellectual property in relation to food security. So the title of his talk is Resolving the Legal Uncertainty Created by the Nagoya Protocol. So, thank you, Brad.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners on the lands on which we all meet. And I'd also like to thank Terry for her presentation. It makes my task somewhat easier going forward. Today, I'll be looking at the Nagoya Protocol, and I'm looking at the historical collection of plants, but the question I'm looking at is thinking about the problems that have arisen in relation to the Nagoya Protocol. As Terry mentioned, the starting point for the Nagoya Protocol is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was introduced in 1992. States have sovereignty over the genetic resources within their borders. Previously, genetic resources were considered the common heritage of humankind, which basically meant that they were able to be appropriated and misappropriated from country to country. The CBD has a number of aims. It aims to promote conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and from my perspective today, the more important one, the fair and equitable benefit sharing of resources. In 2014, the Nagoya Protocol was passed. It was a result of disquiet about the effectiveness of the CBD by a number of member countries. Its goal is to provide guidance about how the CBD is to be implemented. And while the countries could agree on many points, some key issues will lift different interpretations to be implemented by member states. As Terry mentioned, Australia has signed but not yet implemented Nagoya. One of the things I want to talk about today is, despite this, Nagoya is still critically important for Australian researchers, institutions, seed bodies, industry, etc. There are two key questions to think about when we think about Nagoya. Firstly, who needs to comply with Nagoya? And then secondly, what does it mean to be Nagoya compliant? In thinking about Nagoya, the particularities of Nagoya, there are two things I think that stand out. The first one is that it regulates behaviour outside of the countries where it has been adopted into national law. The reason for this is that countries that have ratified the protocol are not only under an obligation to ensure that the material used in the country is Nagoya compliant, they also under an obligation to ensure that the biological material imported into the country was collected, used, and or developed in compliance with the protocol. A second key feature of Nagoya is that there are a number of non-state actors that have adopted Nagoya as a condition of best practice. It's been extended by a number of non-state actors such as universities, herbaria, scientific journals have made Nagoya compliance a precondition with dealing with biological materials. So, for example, although the United States is neither a party to the CBD nor signatory to the Nagoya Protocol, the University of California has decided that Nagoya best practice be a standard when dealing with all genetic materials. As a consequence of this, it changes the question about who needs to comply with Nagoya. Researchers in countries that have adopted Nagoya must comply with local domestic laws. Secondly, researchers who want to export genetic resources to a country that has adopted Nagoya law of that country. And thirdly, researchers who want to work with non-state actors that have decided that they want to be Nagoya compliant must work with them. This means that a researcher working in Australia, who's only working in Australia, does not comply with Nagoya, strictly speaking, because Australia has not yet implemented Nagoya. It would be the same for an American researcher. A researcher in France must comply with the law in France on Nagoya, because France is a part of the European Union and has introduced Nagoya compliant laws. A researcher in the United States who wanted to export material to France would have to show that the material is Nagoya compliant. And likewise, a researcher in Australia who wanted to send material to the University of California would have to show the material was Nagoya compliant. The second key question to think about in relation to Nagoya is, what does it mean to be Nagoya compliant? In most cases, this is relatively straightforward. You only need to show that there's prior informed consent when the material is collected, and secondly, that there is an access and benefit sharing agreement, monetary and non-monetary, and such as the sharing of research results. There are, however, a number of problems with the Nagoya. I'll be focusing today on the problem with historical collections. There are other issues, for example, in relation to material that is protected by the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, or material that is being subject to genomic sequencing, so digital sequence information. There's a great deal of uncertainty in those areas as well. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to focus on one issue, and that's the problem with historical collections. So while showing Nagoya compliance will be straightforward in most cases, problems arise here. The reason for this relates to the temporal uncertainty about the scope of Nagoya. During the negotiations leading up to the adoption of the difference between basically the North and South as to whether the protocol should be limited to material collected after the protocol came into force, or whether it would apply retrospectively back to material collected irrespective of when it was collected. The parties did not reach a compromise during the negotiations about the temporal scope of Nagoya. As a result, individual countries have to decide what they're going to do. Somewhat problematically, different countries have adopted different responses. So, for example, some countries, such as the European Union, have limited the laws to material collected after Nagoya came into force. So if someone is using historical material in the EU, or if they're in a non-EU country such as Australia and they want to export material to one of the 28 EU member states, as the material falls outside the remit of the EU Nagoya law, it would not be necessary for them to show the material was Nagoya compliant. However, in some countries, in a growing number of countries, South Africa, Norway, and now a growing countries, the protocol is triggered whenever genetic material is utilised. This means it applies not only to materials collected after the protocol comes into force, or indeed the CBD, but all material irrespective of when it was collected. Many other countries, African countries, are considering this approach, and this creates particular problems for historical collections. The reasons for this is a researcher working historical collections may find the provenance of the materials unknown or unclear. There may be no information about where and when the material was collected, who the access provider was, whether it was collected with permission, and it may be unclear whether the right to negotiate a retrospective access and beneficiary agreement transfers with the land according to the access provider's will or some other means. What happens, for example, if the material was collected 100 years ago and the owner subsequently sells their land? These create very real problems. As a result, researchers working with historical materials may find they are unable to negotiate with the relevant access provider to obtain the necessary approval. They may not be able to show that, in a sense, that they are Nagoya compliant. So where does this leave researchers working with historical collections? What would happen, for example, if a researcher wanted to access a pre-Nagoya historical collection of soy or sorghum or macadamia with unclear lineage in a way that was Nagoya compliant? The answer will depend on where the researcher is working and what they want to do with the materials. So where a researcher is working only within a specific country, the law of that country will apply. Thus, if they're working in Australia and Australia only, no problem, because we're not yet a signatory implemented Nagoya. If you're working in France, also not a problem, because Nagoya is prospective only. It would be a problem, though, if you work in South Africa, because Nagoya is retrospective, and so you have to prove prior informed consent and benefit sharing with the access provider. Situation where researcher wants to export plant material creates additional problems. In this case, the researcher's activities would be governed by the law of the importing country. So an Australian-based researcher who wants to export to France will be okay, but Australian-based researcher who wants to export to South Africa will not. In the first case, they don't need to show Nagoya compliance. In the second case, they do. Where a researcher works with a non-state actor, this will depend on what the non-state actor means by Nagoya compliance, and whether they stipulate that Nagoya compliance is prospective or retrospective compliance. Research that I've conducted to date has shown that most of the non-state actors are unclear, silent on this issue. The situation remains opaque. The upshot is the confusion, uncertainty, which is inhibiting access to materials. It deters ex situ collections from taking new accessions and limits research. And these are very real problems that people are experiencing more and more going forward. The key point of my talk today was not just to highlight these problems, but also to discuss some of the issues about what can be done going forward. And I think there are really two key options here. The first option is to amend the Nagoya Protocol to expressly deal with plants in historical collections. There are a number of problems with this, however. Firstly, international lawmaking is slow, cumbersome, unpredictable, and I think very unlikely to reach a conclusion. Secondly, given that there's still a divergence of opinion, a very strong divergence of opinion between member countries to whether the protocol should apply to historical material, it's highly international consensus to begin to amend Nagoya in this way. As a result, I think the second option and the better option would be to develop a common understanding of what Nagoya compliance means. So rather than waiting for reform at the international level, this option would be one that is built up over time through a micro-level collaborative interaction and partner engagement. So this would require research organisations, journals, herbaria, seed banks, funding bodies, such as the Gates Foundation and other non-state actors, to clarify what they mean by Nagoya compliance via best practice agreements. A group of people I am working with at the moment to develop these things, and we're working with some of these bodies going forward in this thing. One of the things that thinking about is what should these best practice principles be based on, and what should they do? I think a number of things are really relatively straightforward. Firstly, they need to be consistent, they need to be easy to apply, and they need to be uniform. It's very important, particularly in relation to the latter point, that researchers, as far as possible, understand in advance what they can do and need to do going forward. Secondly, it's important that these principles recognise the role of access providers, even if they can't be found, and this is particularly the case in relation to Indigenous peoples. Thirdly, the best practice principles should facilitate scientific access and use, and this is particularly important in relation to climate change, which is affecting the ability to and the importance of materials in historical collections. Thirdly, we need to recognise that the global nature of plant genetic resource means that researchers may eventually have to meet the higher standard of a retrospective Nagoya. And in fact, there is a sense in which we have to work to the lowest common denominator going forward. These are basic principles that I think are really important for us going forward. And I think that, so as a consequence, the best practice principles should, one, they should be retrospective. So they should work on the basis that Nagoya is retrospective, even if working in a country that is prospective going forward. This would deal with situations where provenance is unclear. And I think the key issue here is what happens when you're dealing with a situation where someone is trying to access material and it's unclear where the materials come from, what's been protected. I think here we can learn lessons from copyright law, which has an idea of orphan works. In copyright law, for a long time now, there's been a problem about people trying to get access to photographs in particular. Copyright law, photographer plus 50 or 70 years, depending upon the jurisdiction. People trying to get permission to get approval to reproduce a photograph often struggle with trying to find the photographer or their heirs to work out and how they get permission. To deal with this problem, the European Union some years ago introduced a special law called Orphan Works, and it says that where a person has done undergone due diligence, best practice, and done all that they can to identify what plants are, or so what the copyright work is, who the owners are, and they can't find them, they can go ahead and publish the work. But in the situation where an owner subsequently comes forward, there's a special agreement arranged in place to work out how benefits could be shared between the owner of the copyright and the photograph and the people who've reproduced it. I suggest a similar rule or provision could apply in relation to plants. So someone was going to access material, say from a historical, and they couldn't find who had provided the initial access. They had done due diligence. They'd searched in the Queensland archives and the whatever Queensland Herbarium and been able to find who provided the materials. They should then be able to continue undertaking research on that material, safe in the knowledge that they can't be sued, but secure in the fact that if an owner was subsequently found, that some sort of arrangement would be able to be struck so that the owner could be compensated, but the research could continue. This would ensure that provenance is unclear, but access is granted via a sort of due diligence exception, that access providers receive some benefits by the spirit of the CBD. Thank you very much.
Fantastic talk, which really highlights quite a big problem. Let's begin with the live Q&A. There's a question that's come in from Sally Norton. She would like to know if gene bank collections operate under the plant treaty for permitted uses, how does this interact with Nagoya?
Okay, thanks, Sally. Sorry, I've got an awful hay fever at the moment. I can hardly breathe. It really depends, and this is in Queensland. Queensland has just amended its laws to state that the Queensland biodiscovery laws do not apply to material which is in Annex 1 of the plant treaty. So that's the 64 plants that are listed there in the plant treaty. One of the problems with Nagoya is that the Nagoya Protocol doesn't actually say Annex 1. It just says that laws can be introduced to create an exception to Nagoya compliance where there's a comparable international law. And there's basically three different regimes, three different types of ways of interpreting that. The European Union has adopted the language in Nagoya nearly directly into its local law, so it's basically very vague. Queensland has taken, I think, what is a very straightforward approach, which just says if it's in Annex 1, then you don't need to be Nagoya compliant. A third group of countries, however, say if it's in the multilateral system, and it's unclear when things become part of the multilateral system. So the answer is it's not 100% clear going forward, and that's one of the things I think that would need to be addressed. So apologies for being a bit vague, but it is one of the areas where Nagoya is particularly one of the three areas where I think Nagoya is unclear and needs to be clarified.
I have a quick question. So you highlighted many problems and also somehow solutions, but in general, how adaptable or flexible is the protocol? So, for example, let's say keeping up with demand, so to speak, with the availability and need for genetic resources as this widens, to keep up with food demand and climate change, for example, is it likely that new and more issues are going to arise?
Yes, certainly new issues arise all the time. The problem is that the international community is now so divided. So countries that have historically provided materials, so the mega biodiverse countries, particularly the ones that have been are much less reluctant to be compliant with the needs of Europe and America and Japan, who've been driving the agenda for a long time now. So you've got a very clear divide between the world, and the treaty needs to be, it's a consensual agreement, and I think it's highly unlikely anything's going to happen. There's been an attempt for 25 years to develop a law in relation to traditional knowledge, and we're really no closer now than we were 20 years ago, because it's very different perspectives from different countries. So I think the need is there, but I think at the international level, there's no solution. I think the best option is for scientists, people working for gene banks, to get together. I've started a project with Nature Publishing. Nature is thinking about making Nagoya compliance a condition of publishing. So someone mentions they're working on a plant in their art, have to tick a box saying that they can testify that when they worked on the material, it was, it was done in a fashion which was Nagoya compliant. I'm trying to work with them to specify what they mean by Nagoya compliant. So if you get someone like the Gates Foundation, Australian Gene Bank, and all the universities together, we can develop a best practice going. I think that's a much more pragmatic and realistic way to deal with the problems.
Yeah, thank you. Just time for one more. Is there any example of best practice agreement that is Nagoya compliant?
Yeah, there are a number of research organisations that have developed best practice agreements, but I think that they tend to be fairly internally focused. I haven't come across one as yet that is globally focused going forward. So hopefully one could be developed fairly soon.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for. So if anyone's got any other questions, they can post it through directly to Brad. Thank you once again, Brad. That was fantastic. Up next, we have our third and final keynote for the session, in Seeds in Culture and Society, before we have a short break. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ola Westengen, who is an associate professor at the Department of International Environment and Development Studies at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Dr. Ola works on the intersections of science and policy research on crop diversity and seed systems. Previous to his current university position, he worked for the Crop Trust, the FAO, and the Nordic Genetic Resource Centre. He was the first coordinator of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault from 2007 to 2015 and carries out research on conservation and use of genetic resources, seed supply systems, food security and adaptation to climate change, crop evolution and crop diversity as biocultural heritage. The title of his talk is International Collaboration to Safeguard Crop Diversity, the Rescue of the International Gene Bank Collection at Icarda in Syria. Thank you so much, Ola. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's actually a relatively warm early autumn morning here in Oslo, where I am, but I know that you in your part of the world are heading for warmer times. But in this talk, I will take you to a cold place. I'll take you to the Arctic islands of Svalbard and the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. So I'll be doing two things in this talk. I will talk about the emerging global system for ex situ genetic resources conservation and its governance. And I'll talk about the seed vault's place in this emerging ex situ system. I'll also then provide a first-hand account of the story of the rescue of the international collection of Icarda, the gene bank that was located in Syria and now is located in Morocco and Lebanon. I will be documenting and analyzing this event, which provide, I think, a unique source of insights into what a resilient global ex situ conservation system entails in terms of technical, institutional, and policy factors. Okay, first let me take you to Svalbard. This group of islands is found about midway between the northernmost tip of mainland Norway and the North Pole. Svalbard is subject to the International Svalbard Treaty from 1920, which recognizes Norway's sovereignty, but at the same time ensures the right of other treaty nations to enter and use natural resources at Svalbard. And importantly, the Svalbard Treaty also ensures that this archipelago remains demilitarized. This group of islands, 60% of the land on these islands are covered by glaciers, and the entire land area has permafrost year-round, meaning that the mountains there are frozen. These are, of course, excellent conditions for seed storage, or at least preconditions for seed storage. And what you see here is the entrance of the seed vault, the portal. Inside the mountain, there is a long concrete reinforced tunnel leading down to 3 storage chambers. The facility is located about 130 meters above the sea level, well above the worst case scenarios for climate change induced sea level rise. The facility has a high security entrance system and concrete reinforced walls all the way through, and it actually only opens 2 to 3 times per year for new deposits arriving from gene banks around the world. In 2019, the seed vault underwent an upgrade. This was necessary to make the entrance completely waterproof, because currently we see that the permafrost at Svalbard is slowly melting. But the storage conditions inside the seed vault, inside these storage chambers, are dry and cold. So they are cooled down to, so the permafrost naturally holds the temperature at about -6 degrees, but then with additional cooling, the seed vault holds about -18 degrees Celsius. This is in accordance with the FAO gene bank standards for long-term conservation of seeds. The seeds themselves are stored in sealed aluminium foil pouches inside these deposit boxes that you see on the shelves in one of the chambers here. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened its doors for this kind of long-term storage of or safety duplication of seed accessions in 2008. And all the time since its planning phase, this has been a very collaborative project. And the seed vault is today managed under a tripartite agreement between the Norwegian government, represented by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, the Nordic Genetic Resources Center, so basically the Nordic Gene Bank, and the international independent organization, the Crop Trust. Today, the seed vault contains safety duplicates of more than 1 million accessions from 88 gene banks around the world. And I believe there are at least 2 Australian gene banks that are making use of the seed vault for safety duplication. So a little bit about the international policy context. The objective of the seed vault is to be the ultimate security net for ex situ collections of PGRFA from around the world. And this is an objective in line with international policy agendas and agreements in the field. And I'd say most importantly, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, the ITPGRFA. But also other related FAO institutions, such as the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, in which, for example, these gene bank standards that I referred to were developed some years back. And then I'd like to talk a bit, well, it's also important to see that it's not only the treaty and the CBD that deals with kind of the framework of the seed vault, but you also actually find the objective as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically in this Target 2.5 about maintaining the genetic diversity of plants and animals. The FAO's VIEWS database, the World Information Early Warning System, contains about 5.4 million accessions from our over 7,000 genera conserved in 710 gene banks in 103 countries. But this data that FAO holds there is only metadata, so we don't have accession level information from FAO. And it is at this accession level that we can know exactly what is collected and conserved where and what gaps remains. And I'd say that the organization that works most dedicated to assembling such data these days is the international organization, the Crop Trust. The Crop Trust is working towards a goal of an effective, sustainable global system for ex situ conservation. They are raising funds for an endowment fund that is intended to fund international gene banks and national gene banks in the global south. But they also carry out projects within collecting, conserving, and making crop diversity available. And the idea that they have expressed graphically here is that not everyone needs to do everything, but one should move towards a system that is more rational with a division of tasks and responsibilities. That's not easy, of course. That's challenging both politically and technically. I don't have much time to go into the politics here, but I'll say something about how these technical challenges are being addressed. So sort of a virtual overview of the planetary resources in the global ex situ system is found in the Global Information System under the treaty, the GLIS. Part of this GLIS is an online portal for accession level information called Genesis PGR. This database now contains data on more than 4 million accessions from 33 data providers, including both the European and United States networks of gene banks. There are now more than 4 million accessions in this database, and it is thus really a database of databases. And this is just a map showing where these accessions are from. If you access information about a particular accession in GenBank, as I've done in the screen that you see on the right-hand side here, you can find out if it's available as part of the multilateral system of the treaty. And you can also find out, well, you can find out a lot about the accession, depending on how much characterization data, etc., the GenBanks have uploaded. But you can also find out whether the accession has been safety duplicated in the Svalbard global seed vault. You can also get to this information by going to the so-called seed portal of the seed vault itself. That's where you can find this number of more than 1 million safety duplicates from 88 gene banks today. I'd like to say a little bit more about the CGIR gene banks, because the Icarda gene bank is one of them. In many ways, it's these international collections that are under Article 15 in trust for humankind in the Plant Treaty. It's in many ways those that are the backbone of the global ex situ system. By the end of 2020, CGIR gene banks were managing a total of 736,000 accessions of both crops, forages, and trees. And approximately 82% of this total collection is acceptably viable, free of quarantinable diseases, and they have sufficient amounts of seeds to be internationally distributed. Out of these accessions, 60% are safety duplicated at 2 levels, and 78% of them is duplicated in the Svalbard global seed vault. From the annual report of the GeneBank platform of 2020, there are a lot of interesting, there's a lot of interesting information that I'd like to touch upon here. So on this graph, you can see the GeneBank distributions from the CGIAR since 2012. There was a decline in distribution in 2020. This was mainly due to COVID lockdown and restrictions, but this gives you an impression of the kind of magnitude of distribution from these GeneBanks annually. Out of these external distributions in 2020, 42% of the samples were sent to universities or research institutions. 31% were sent to national agricultural research systems, and the rest were sent to commercial sector, NGOs, farmers, and others. Actually, the number of samples distributed to the category farmers, farmer organizations, and NGOs are on par with the number of accessions distributed to the commercial sector. In 2020, 75% of the germplasm distribution went outside the CGIAR to 78 countries, and that's what you see on the map here. And actually, the category lower to middle income countries received the largest proportion, with about 50% of the germplasm shipped in 2020 going to such countries. Most samples were traditional cultivars or crop wild relatives, and the top country recipients in 2020 were India, Morocco, Nigeria, Italy, China, South Africa. And then one of the most important of all of these GeneBanks is the Icarda GeneBank. That's located in the middle of the Fertile Crescent, the earliest center of origin of agriculture on the planet. The Icarda collections include thousands of traditional land races and wild relatives of staple food, representing a very unique diversity. Much of it probably no longer found in the field. This GeneBank is important not only for agriculture in the Middle East, but for global food production and food security. Since this GeneBank was established in 1976, the research center has worked in more than 50 countries with temperate dryland agriculture, focusing on a range of cropping systems. And as I said, as a CGIAR GeneBank, the Icarda GeneBank is one of the Article 15 collections under the treaty. It has currently approximately 160,000 accessions, and also most of their accessions are land races and crop wild relatives. In 2015, the Gregor Mendel Award was presented to the Icarda Director General for the remarkable efforts of the GeneBank staff to continue working during the war in Syria. And part of this remarkable effort was that they were able to safely duplicate their collections at Svalbard. This was, I'd say, no less than a heroic effort. They were conserving and safeguarding there outside Aleppo. Tal Hedia is the name of the site of the research station. They were conserving a natural and cultural history for humankind, and that this was not risk-free, I guess all of us can understand, but it's also illustrated by this other story from The Guardian in 2015 about an archaeologist who was killed by the IS militants because he refused to take them to some of the sites, the cultural heritage sites of Palmyra. In April 2014, Icarda went public with the story about the safety duplication, because when the war broke out in Syria in March 2011, Icarda had already safety duplicated more than 100,000 accessions at Svalbard. And they actually continued their work during the warfare, also with shipping out safety duplicates. So they shipped out from the war zone 3 shipments in 2012, 2013, and 2014. And here are some photos documenting this rescue operation. The shipments to Svalbard were timed according to the security situation in Aleppo, and I worked as the coordinator of the seed vault at that time, timed the openings, of course, according to the security situation. The last deposit was sent from Aleppo in January 2014. And that was when the last staff was forced to leave the premises in the Tel Hadia Gene Bank. At that time, they had safety duplicated 83% of all the accessions stored in the gene bank in Svalbard, and in addition, they had sent out almost the remaining number as safety duplicates to Turkey under black box conditions. Remarkably, the seed boxes that we received up at Svalbard were accompanied with the correct paperwork as regards phytosanitary certificates and export permits. So Icarda did some remote monitoring of the gene bank premises until April 2017. Since then, they haven't been able to monitor, and we don't have good information about the state of the gene bank collections in Tal Hadia outside Aleppo anymore. But we know that the premises have been occupied by at least 2 armed groups, and it's pretty certain that if the original collections are not destroyed, the viability of the seeds will have been affected by these long power cuts, etc. under this situation. But the staff of Icarda moved to Lebanon and Morocco, and after a while, after establishing there, they requested their seeds back to re-establish their collections there. And then already in 2015, they started to return their safety duplicates to start regenerating the material and multiplying the material. And here are some photos documenting this return. Icarda staff even traveled up to Svalbard to oversee the return of boxes. When the boxes of seeds had reached Icarda in Lebanon and Morocco, the enormous work of regeneration and multiplication started. More than 30,000 samples have been regenerated annually since 2016. The regenerated accessions are multiplied to the point where enough quality seeds is available for further long-term storage, but also for distribution and new safety duplication into locations. And in the paper we recently wrote about this, the latest season we could report on was the 2019 season, and 83,000 accessions had then already been made available to users of the Icarda collection, and also then returned to Svalbard for further safety duplication. This is an enormous work, and I don't think I have time to go into the details of what it takes to regenerate such a number of species, many of them being outcrossing, many of them requiring very controlled regeneration conditions. It just takes an enormous effort. And so the Icarda staff is continuing to really do an enormous effort for this natural and cultural heritage. Even last year under the pandemic, they were able to safety duplicate or to regenerate 30,000 accessions. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay. In addition to the technical lessons that we learned from this, there are also many institutional and policy insights. First and foremost, this story shows that international cooperation is essential to safeguard the genetic resources and crop diversity for public use for future generations. The international collaboration behind this rescue operation is really underpinned by the legal framework provided by the Commission on Genetic Resources, and the Plant Treaty. These FAO bodies were important in many ways. Firstly, by welcoming Norway's proposal to take on the task of constructing the seed vault in the first place. Secondly, by providing Icarda, despite its relocation, the legal recognition to continue to function as an international gene bank. And thirdly, by providing the basis for Icarda, CGIAR, and Crop Trust to seek funding to undertake this reconstruction of their facilities and to regenerate their collections. We wrote up the story in a paper that was published in Nature Plants late last year, and my co-authors there are among those who really undertook these gigantic efforts. And you see Mariana Jaspek, Ahmed Amri from Icarda in the picture here. You see Charlotte Lusty from the Crop Trust, and Åsmund Asdal, the one who took over my job as coordinator of the seed vault. All of them are part of the author team on this paper. But I'd really like to underline that the real kind of heroes of this story is the staff of Talhedia, the staff that stayed on post in the gene bank in outside Aleppo and were able to safeguard all these collections. This is really a story that resonates with this famous story of the staff of the Vavilov Institute in Leningrad or St. Petersburg, who maintained the Vavilov gene bank there during the Nazi siege in the winter of 1941 to 42. So just to kind of repeat, okay, so what does such a system take? I think one may say that the Plant Treaty, the FAO gene bank standards, and Genesis and Crop Trust monitoring and financing systems represents the essential software of this global ex situ system, and then that the Svalbard Global Seed Vault and the Article 15 collections and the public gene banks in all the member countries of the treaty are really the hardware of this system. This story has gotten quite a lot of media attention, and also that paper of ours last year got quite a lot of media attention, not least thanks to Nature's feature article about it. And it's covered internationally as well as in Syrian kind of exile environments media. I'd like to end with this quote from Ban Ki-moon from when he visited the seed vault. This gift to humanity and symbol of peace will continue to inspire and serve for generations to come. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Ola, for such a great talk. Thanks for sharing a real-world example showing the sheer value of gene banks and the power of Svalbard in particular. We already have a few questions coming in, so we'll open up the Q&A session now. First up, we have a question from Damien Wrigley. He says, given the success of Svalbard and the challenges presented by climate change and unpredictable political unrest, do you think we should be looking to create a similar facility in the Southern Hemisphere? And if so, what would be your key advice for the development of such a facility?
Well, yeah, that is an idea, and I won't be the one to kind of say whether that is necessary or not. But I think that, for resilience, you need a certain redundancy. So I've been talking about sort of a rational and effective system, but I also believe that you really need to have some duplication of efforts. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. But I think, okay, what lessons can we learn from the Svalbard history? I think really key is international trust. And I think that for Norway's idea to establish this seed vault, it was really key that Norway had earned certain trust in the international community in the negotiations of the Plant Treaty, for example. It was seen as kind of politically neutral. And I think that neutrality and that trust is really key.
Did Icarda access seeds and germplasm through the use of the material transfer agreement of the plant treaty or under the black box condition of the Svalbard seed vault?
The standard contract for depositing seeds at Svalbard says that it's only the depositing institute that can retrieve the seeds, right? So there's no distribution to third parties from Svalbard. In the case of Icarda, they could claim their seeds back as the owner institution. So that was not under the SMTA, but it was their black boxes, or not really black boxes, because the information is all out there in the seed portal and Genesis. But they claimed their seeds back under that contract, deposit contract with the seed vault.
Jose Barrero, he would like to know, what are the requisites needed to include a new accession in the seed bank? How different needs to be from previous deposits, and how are there any guidelines?
Yeah, so again, it's this standard deposit agreement that says that the deposits to the seed vault should be unique. So material that we know already is safety duplicated in the seed vault are not encouraged. But then again, one needs to have some redundancy in such a system, and it also needs to function practically. And we all know that it's very hard to say whether two accessions sitting in two different gene banks are genetically similar or distinct. So I think there is a bit of duplication also inside the seed vault collections, but we really try to avoid outright duplication, that that two gene banks would deposit exactly the same collections, for example. So it is an ideal to have as much unique germplasm as possible, but there is plenty of space in the seed vault, so it's more important to make sure that we really have the diversity than to avoid duplication.
Yeah. One last final question. Years ago, there was talk about expanding the Annex 1 list of species. Is this still being considered, or is it under negotiation?
It's still being considered, but it's unfortunately not under negotiations now. I was present at the last meeting of the governing body of the plant treaty, and actually negotiations collapsed. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but over exactly this issue, over the changes. Everyone kind of sees that one needs to make some changes to the multilateral system to make it function better. And one of the issues there is whether one should increase the number of, the list of species included in the multilateral system. But there are many other elements to that as well. And one issue is this issue of digital sequence information, so-called DSI. And now I guess there is a lot of negotiations going on in the back room, and hopefully there will be a resolution to this. But at the moment we have the list, the Annex 1 list. That said, that doesn't really make a big difference for the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, where it's not only multilateral system species that are duplicated there. All genetic resources that are relevant for food and agriculture can be duplicated there. And the deposit agreement only says that the original collections needs to be made available in accordance with international law. And that can be, different from country to country, from depositor to depositor. So all these politics there, important politics there, does not, at least directly, or affect the operation of the seed vault.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. We've already gone slightly over time. Thank you once again, Ola. That was absolutely fantastic talk.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So that brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank all three of our keynote speakers. What a great start. We're now going to have a short 10-minute or so break, and we will then continue with the second part of this theme afterwards. So see you all back here soon.